Hi, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're reading Kidnapped, chapters 9 and 10. Chapter 9, The Man with the Belt of Gold. More than a week went by in which the ill luck that had hitherto pursued the Covenant upon this voyage grew yet more strongly marked. Some days she made a little way, others she was driven actually back. At last we were beaten so far to the south that we tossed and tacked to and fro the whole of the 9th day, within sight of Cape Wrath and the wild rocky coast on either hand of it. There followed on that a council of the officers, and some decision which I did not rightly understand, seeing only the result, that we had made a fair wind of a foul one, and were running south. The 10th afternoon there was a falling swell and a thick, wet, white fog that hid one end of the brig from the other. All afternoon, when I went on deck, I saw men and officers listening hard over the bulwarks for breakers, they said, and though I did not so much as understand the word, I felt danger in the air and was excited. Maybe about 10 at night, I was serving Mr. Riach and the captain at their supper when the ship struck something with a great sound, and we heard voices singing out. My two masters leaped to their feet. "She struck," said Mr. Riach. "No, sir," said the captain. "We've only run a boat down," and they hurried out. The captain was in the right of it. We had run down a boat in the fog, and she had parted in the midst and gone to the bottom with all her crew but one. This man, as I heard afterwards, had been sitting in the stern as a passenger, while the rest were on the benches rowing. At the moment of the blow, the stern had been thrown into the air, and the man, having his hands free, and for all he was encumbered with a frieze overcoat that came below his knees, had leaped up and caught hold of the brig's bowsprit. It showed he had luck and much agility and unusual strength, that he should have thus saved himself from such a pass. And yet when the captain brought him into the roundhouse and I set eyes on him for the first time, he looked as cool as I did. He was smallish in stature, but well set and as nimble as a goat. His face was of a good open expression, but sunburnt very dark, and heavily freckled and pitted with the smallpox. His eyes were unusually light and had a kind of dancing madness in them that was both engaging and alarming. And when he took off his greatcoat, he laid a pair of fine silver-mounted pistols on the table, and I saw that he was belted with a great sword. His manners, besides, were elegant, and he pledged the captain handsomely. Altogether I thought of him, at the first sight, that here was a man I would rather call my friend than my enemy. The captain, too, was taking his observations, but rather of the man's clothes than his person, and to be sure, as soon as he had taken off the greatcoat, he showed forth mighty fine for the roundhouse of a merchant brig, having a hat with feathers, a red waistcoat, breeches of black plush, and a blue coat with silver buttons and handsome silver lace. Costly clothes, though somewhat spoiled with the fog and being slept in. "I'm vexed, sir, about the boat," says the captain. "There are some pretty men gone to the bottom," said the stranger, "that I would rather see on the dry land again than half a score of boats." "Friends of yours?" said Hosiason. "You have none such friends in your country," was the reply. "They would have died for me like dogs." "Well, sir," said the captain, still watching him, "there are more men in the world than boats to put them in." "And that's true, too," cried the other with spirit, "and you seem to be a gentleman of great penetration." "I have been in France, sir," says the captain, so that it was plain he meant more by the words than showed upon the face of them. "Well, sir," says the other, "and so has many a pretty man, for the matter of that." "No doubt, sir," says the captain, "and fine coats." "Oh-ho," says the stranger, "is that how the wind sets?" And he laid his hand quickly on his pistols. "Don't be hasty," said the captain. "Don't do a mischief before you see the need of it. You've a French soldier's coat upon your back and a Scotch tongue in your head, to be sure, but so has many an honest fellow in these days, and I dare say none the worse of it." "So," said the gentleman in the fine coat, "are ye of the honest party?" Meaning, was he a Jacobite? For each side in these sort of civil broils takes the name of honesty for its own. "Why, sir," replied the captain, "I am a true blue Protestant, and I thank God for it." It was the first word of any religion I had ever heard from him, but I learnt afterwards he was a great churchgoer while on shore. "But for all that," says he, "I can be sorry to see another man with his back to the wall." "Can you so indeed?" asked the Jacobite. "Well, sir, to be quite plain with you, I'm one of those honest gentlemen that were in trouble about the years 45 and 6, and to be quite plain with you, if I got into the hands of any of the red-coated gentry, it's like it would go hard with me. Now, sir, I was for France, and there was a French ship cruising here to pick me up, but she gave us the go-by in the fog, as I wish from the heart that ye had done yourself, and the best that I can say is this: if you can set me upon shore where I was going, I have that upon me will reward you highly for your trouble." "In France?" says the captain. "No, sir, that I cannot do. But where you come from, we might talk of that." And then unhappily he observed me standing in my corner, and packed me off to the galley to get supper for the gentlemen. I lost no time, I promise you, and when I came back into the round house, I found the gentleman had taken a money belt from about his waist, and poured out a guinea or two upon the table. The captain was looking at the guineas, and then at the belt, and then at the gentleman's face, and I thought he seemed excited. "Half of it," he cried, "and I'm your man." The other swept back the guineas into the belt, and put it on again under his waistcoat. "I have told you, sir," said he, "that not one doit of it belongs to me. It belongs to my chieftain," and here he touched his hat, "and while I would be but a silly messenger to grudge some of it that the rest might come safe, I should show myself a hound indeed if I bought my own carcass any too dear. 30 guineas on the seaside, or 60 if you set me on the Linnhe. Take it if you will, if not, you can do your worst." "Aye," said Hoseyson, "and if I give you over to the soldiers?" "You would make a fool's bargain," said the other. "My chief, let me tell you, sir, is forfeited, like every honest man in Scotland. His estate is in the hands of the man they call King George, and it is his officer that collects the rents, or tries to collect them. But for the honour of Scotland, the poor tenant bodies take a thought upon their chief lying in exile, and this money is a part of that very rent for which King George is looking. Now, sir, ye seem to me to be a man that understands things. Bring this money within the reach of government, and how much of it'll come to you?" "Little enough, to be sure," said Hoseyson, "and then, if they knew," he added dryly. "But I think if I was to try, that I could hold my tongue about it." "Ah, but I'll beguile you there," said the gentleman. "Play me false, and I'll play you cunning. If a hand's laid upon me, they shall ken what money it is." "Well," returned the captain, "what must be must. 60 guineas and done. Here's my hand upon it." "And here's mine," said the other. And thereupon the captain went out, rather hurriedly, I thought, and left me alone in the roundhouse with the stranger. At that period, so soon after the 45, there were many exiled gentlemen coming back at the peril of their lives, either to see their friends or to collect a little money. And as for the Highland chiefs that had been forfeited, it was a common matter of talk how their tenants would stint themselves to send them money, and their clansmen outface the soldiery to get it in, and run the gauntlet of our great navy to carry it across. All this I had, of course, heard tell of, and now I had a man under my eyes whose life was forfeit on all these counts and upon one more, for he was not only a rebel and a smuggler of rents, but had taken service with King Louis of France. And as if all this were not enough, he had a belt full of golden guineas round his loins. Whatever my opinions, I could not look on such a man without a lively interest. "And so you're a Jacobite," said I, as I set meat before him. "Aye," said he, beginning to eat, "and you, by your long face, should be a Whig?" "Betwixt and between," said I, not to annoy him, for indeed I was as good a Whig as Mr. Campbell could make me. "And that's nothing," said he, "but I'm saying, Mr. Betwixt and Between," he added, "this bottle of yours is dry, and it's hard if I'm to pay 60 guineas and be grudged a dram upon the back of it." "I'll go and ask for the keys," said I, and stepped on deck. The fog was close as ever, but the swell almost down. They had laid the brig to, not knowing precisely where they were, and the wind, what little there was of it, not serving well for their true course. Some of the hands were still hearkening for breakers, but the captain and the 2 officers were in the waist with their heads together. It struck me, I don't know why, that they were after no good, and the first word I heard as I drew softly near more than confirmed me. It was Mr. Rioch, crying out as if upon a sudden thought. "Couldn't we wile him out of the roundhouse?" "He's better where he is," returned Hoseyson. "He hasn't room to use his sword." "Well, that's true," said Rioch, "but he's hard to come at." "Hut," said Hoseyson, "we can get the man in talk, one upon each side, and pin him by the 2 arms. Or if that'll not hold, sir, we can make a run by both the doors and get him under hand before he has time to draw." At this hearing I was seized with both fear and anger at these treacherous, greedy, bloody men that I sailed with. My first mind was to run away, my second was bolder. "Captain," said I, "the gentleman is seeking a dram and the bottle's out. Will you give me the key?" They all started and turned about. "Why, here's our chance to get the firearms," Rioch cried, and then to me, "Hark ye, David," he said, "do ye ken where the pistols are?" Aye, put in Hoseyson. David kens. David's a good lad. You see, David, my man, yon wee Highlandman is a danger to the ship, besides being a rank foe to King George, God bless him. I had never been so bedavided since I came on board, and I said yes, as if all I heard were quite natural. The trouble is, resumed the captain, that all our firelocks, great and little, are in the roundhouse under this man's nose, likewise the powder. Now, if I or one of the officers was to go in and take them, he would fall to thinking. But a lad like you, David, might snap up a horn and a pistol or two without remark. And if you can do it cleverly, I'll bear it in mind when it'll be good for you to have friends, and that's when we come to Carolina. Here Mr. Riach whispered him a little. Very right, sir, said the captain, and then to myself, and see here, David, yon man has a belt full of gold, and I give you my word that you shall have your fingers in it. I told him I would do as he wished, though indeed I had scarce breath to speak with, and upon that he gave me the key of the spirit locker, and I began to go slowly back to the roundhouse. What was I to do? They were dogs and thieves. They had stolen me from my country. They had killed poor Ransom, and was I to hold the candle to another murder? But then, upon the other hand, there was the fear of death very plain before me, for what could a boy and a man, if they were as brave as lions, do against a whole ship's company? I was still arguing it back and forth, and getting no great clearness, when I came into the roundhouse and saw the Jacobite eating his supper under the lamp. And at that my mind was made up all in a moment. I have no credit by it. It was by no choice of mine, but as if by compulsion, that I walked right up to the table and put my hand on his shoulder. Do you want to be killed? Asked I. He sprang to his feet and looked a question at me as clear as if he had spoken. Oh, cried I, they're all murderers here. It's a ship full of them. They've murdered a boy already. Now it's you. Aye, said he, but they haven't got me yet. And then looking at me curiously, will you stand with me? That will I, said I. I am no thief, nor yet murderer. I'll stand by you. Why then, said he, what's your name? David Balfour, said I, and then thinking that a man with so fine a coat must like fine people, I added for the first time, of Shaw's. It never occurred to him to doubt me, for a Highlander is used to see great, gentle folks in great poverty, but as he had no estate of his own, my words nettled a very childish vanity he had. My name is Stewart, he said, drawing himself up. Alan Breck, they call me. A king's name is good enough for me, though I bear it plain and have the name of no farm midden to clap to the hind end of it. And having administered this rebuke, as though it were something of a chief importance, he turned to examine our defenses. The roundhouse was built very strong to support the breaching of the seas. Of its 5 apertures, only the skylight and the 2 doors were large enough for the passage of a man. The doors, besides, could be drawn close. They were of stout oak and ran in grooves and were fitted with hooks to keep them either shut or open as the need arose. The one that was already shut I secured in this fashion, but when I was proceeding to slide to the other, Alan stopped me. David, said he, for I cannot bring to mind the name of your landed estate, and so will make so bold as to call you David, that door being open is the best part of my defenses. It would be yet better shut, says I. Not so, David, says he. You see, I have but one face, but so long as that door is open and my face to it, the best part of my enemies will be in front of me, where I wish to find them. Then he gave me from the rack a cutlass, of which there were a few besides the firearms, choosing it with great care, shaking his head and saying he had never in all his life seen poorer weapons. And next he set me down to the table with the powder horn, a bag of bullets, and all the pistols which he bade me charge. And that will be better work, let me tell you, said he, for a gentleman of decent birth, than scraping plates and raxing drams to a ween tarry sailors. Thereupon he stood up in the midst with his face to the door, and drawing his great sword, made trial of the room he had to wield it in. I must stick to the point, he said, shaking his head, and that's a pity, too. It doesn't set my genius, which is all for the upper guard. And now, said he, do you keep on charging the pistols, and give heed to me. I told him I would listen closely. My chest was tight, my mouth dry, the light dark to my eyes. The thought of the numbers that were soon to leap in upon us kept my heart in a flutter, and the sea which I heard washing around the brig, and where I thought my dead body would be cast ere morning, ran in my mind strangely. First of all, said he, how many are against us? I reckoned them up, and such was the hurry of my mind I had to cast the numbers twice. 15, said I. Allen whistled. Well, said he, that can't be cured, and now follow me. It is my part to keep this door where I look for the main battle. In that ye have no hand. And mind and dinna fire to this side unless they get me down. For I would rather have 10 foes in front of me than one friend like you cracking pistols at my back. I told him, indeed, I was no great shot. And that's very bravely said, he cried in a great admiration of my candor. There's many a pretty gentleman that wouldn't dare to say it. But then, sir, said I, there is the door behind you, which they may perhaps break in. Aye, says he, and that is a part of your work. No sooner the pistol's charged than you must climb up into yon bed where you're handy at the window, and if they lift hand against the door, you're to shoot. But that's not all. Let's make a bit of a soldier of you, David. What else have you to guard? There's the skylight, said I, but indeed, Mr. Stewart, I would need to have eyes upon both sides to keep the two of them. For when my face is at the one, my back is to the other. And that's very true, said Allen, but have you no ears to your head? To be sure, cried I must hear the bursting of the glass. Ye have some rudiments of sense, said Allen grimly. Chapter 10. The Siege of the Round House. But now our time of truce was come to an end. Those on deck had waited for my coming till they grew impatient, and scarce had Allen spoken when the captain showed face in the open door. Stand, cried Allen, and pointed his sword at him. The captain stood indeed, but he neither winced nor drew back a foot. A naked sword, says he? This is a strange return for hospitality. Do you see me, said Allen? I am come of kings. I bear a king's name. My badge is the oak. Do you see my sword? It has slashed the heads off mair whigamores than you have toes upon your feet. Call up your vermin to your back, sir, and fall on. The sooner the clash begins, the sooner you'll taste this steel throughout your vitals. The captain said nothing to Allen, but he looked over at me with an ugly look. David, said he, I'll mind this, and the sound of his voice went through me with a jar. Next moment he was gone. And now, said Allen, let your hand keep your head, for the grip is coming. Allen drew a dirk, which he held in his left hand in case they should run in under his sword. I, on my part, clambered up into the berth with an armful of pistols and something of a heavy heart, and set open the window where I was to watch. It was a small part of the deck that I could overlook, but enough for our purpose. The sea had gone down, and the wind was steady and kept the sails quiet, so that there was a great stillness in the ship, in which I made sure I heard the sound of muttering voices. A little after, and there came a clash of steel upon the deck, by which I knew they were dealing out the cutlasses, and one had been let fall. And after that, silence again. I do not know if I was what you call afraid, but my heart beat like a bird's, both quick and little, and there was a dimness came before my eyes, which I continually rubbed away, and which continually returned. As for hope, I had none, but only a darkness of despair and a sort of anger against all the world that made me long to sell my life as dear as I was able. I tried to pray, I remember, but that same hurry of my mind, like a man running, would not suffer me to think upon the words, and my chief wish was to have the thing begin and be done with it. It came all of a sudden when it did, with a rush of feet and a roar, and then a shout from Allen, and a sound of blows and someone crying out as if hurt. I looked back over my shoulder and saw Mr. Shuan in the doorway, crossing blades with Allen. That's him that killed the boy, I cried. Look to your window, said Allen, and as I turned back to my place, I saw him pass his sword through the mate's body. It was none too soon for me to look to my own part, for my head was scarce back at the window before 5 men, carrying a spare yard for a battering ram, ran past me and took post to drive the door in. I had never fired with a pistol in my life, and not often with a gun, far less against a fellow creature. But it was now or never, and just as they swang the yard, I cried out, "Take that," and shot into their midst. I must have hit one of them, for he sang out and gave back a step, and the rest stopped as if a little disconcerted. Before they had time to recover, I sent another ball over their heads, and at my third shot, which went as wide as the second, the whole party threw down the yard and ran for it. Then I looked round again into the deck house. The whole place was full of the smoke of my own firing, just as my ears seemed to be burst with the noise of the shots. But there was Allen, standing as before, only now his sword was running blood to the hilt, and himself so swelled with triumph and fallen into so fine an attitude that he looked to be invincible. Right before him on the floor was Mr. Schuon on his hands and knees. The blood was pouring from his mouth, and he was sinking slowly lower with a terrible white face. And just as I looked, some of those from behind caught hold of him by the heels and dragged him bodily out of the roundhouse. I believed he died as they were doing it. "There's one of your wigs for sure," cried Allen, and then turning to me, he asked if I had done much execution. I told him I had winged one, and thought it was the captain. "And I've settled too," says he. "No, there's not enough blood let. They'll be back again. To your watch, David. This is but a dram before meat." I settled back to my place, recharging the 3 pistols I had fired, and keeping watch with both eye and ear. Our enemies were disputing not far off upon the deck, and that so loudly that I could hear a word or two above the washing of the seas. "It was Schuon balked it," I heard one say, and another answered him with a "Whisht, man, he's paid the piper." After that the voices fell again into the same muttering as before. Only now, one person spoke most of the time as though laying down a plan, and first one and then another answered him briefly, like men taking orders. By this I made sure they were coming on again, and told Allen. "It's what we have to pray for," said he. "Unless we can give them a good distaste of us, and done with it, there'll be nae sleep for either you or me. But this time, mind, they'll be in earnest." By this, my pistols were ready, and there was nothing to do but listen and await. While the brush lasted, I had not the time to think if I was frighted, but now, when all was still again, my mind ran upon nothing else. The thought of the sharp swords and the cold steel was strong in me, and presently, when I began to hear stealthy steps and a brushing of men's clothes against the roundhouse wall, and knew they were taking their places in the dark, I could have found it in my mind to cry out aloud. All this was upon Allen's side, and I had begun to think my share of the fight was at an end, when I heard someone drop softly on the roof above me. Then there came a single call on the sea pipe, and that was the signal. A knot of them made one rush of it, cutlass in hand, against the door, and at the same moment the glass of the skylight was dashed in 1,000 pieces, and a man leaped through and landed on the floor. Before he got his feet, I had clapped a pistol to his back and might have shot him too, only at the touch of him, and him alive, my whole flesh misgave me, and I could no more pull the trigger than I could have flown. He had dropped his cutlass as he jumped, and when he felt the pistol, whipped straight round and laid hold of me, roaring out an oath, and at that either my courage came again, or I grew so much afraid as came to the same thing, for I gave a shriek and shot him in the midst of the body. He gave the most horrible, ugly groan and fell to the floor. The foot of a second fellow, whose legs were dangling through the skylight, struck me at the same time upon the head, and at that I snatched another pistol and shot this one through the thigh, so that he slipped through and tumbled in a heap on his companion's body. There was no talk of missing any more than there was time to aim. I clapped the muzzle to the very place and fired. I might have stood and stared at them for long, but I heard Allen shout as if for help, and that brought me to my senses. He had kept the door so long, but one of the seamen, while he was engaged with others, had run in under his guard and caught him about the body. Allen was dirking him with his left hand, but the fellow clung like a leech. Another had broken in and had his cutlass raised. The door was thronged with their faces. I thought we were lost, and catching up my cutlass, fell on them in flank. But I had not time to be of help. The wrestler dropped at last, and Allen, leaping back to get his distance, ran upon the others like a bull, roaring as he went. They broke before him like water, turning and running, and falling one against another in their haste. The sword in his hands flashed like quicksilver into the huddle of our fleeing enemies, and at every flash there came the scream of a man hurt. I was still thinking we were lost when, lo, they were all gone, and Allen was driving them along the deck as a sheepdog chases sheep. Yet he was no sooner out than he was back again, being as cautious as he was brave. And meanwhile the seamen continued running and crying out as if he was still behind them, and we heard them tumble one upon another into the forecastle and clap to the hatch upon the top. The roundhouse was like a shambles. 3 were dead inside, another lay in his death agony across the threshold, and there were Allen and I, victorious and unhurt. He came up to me with open arms. "Come to my arms," he cried, and embraced and kissed me hard upon both cheeks. "David," said he, "I love you like a brother. And oh, man," he cried in a kind of ecstasy, "am I no a bonny fighter?" Thereupon he turned to the 4 enemies, passed his sword clean through each of them, and tumbled them out of doors one after the other. As he did so, he kept humming and singing and whistling to himself, like a man trying to recall an air, only what he was trying was to make one. All the while the flush was in his face, and his eyes were as bright as a 5-year-old's child with a new toy. And presently he sat down upon the table, sword in hand. The air that he was making all the time began to run a little clearer, and then clearer still. And then out he burst with a great voice into a Gaelic song. I have translated it here, not in verse, of which I have no skill, but at least in the king's English. He sang it often afterwards, and the thing became popular, so that I have heard it and had it explained to me many's the time. This is the song of the sword of Alan. The smith made it, the fire set it, now it shines in the hand of Alan Breck. Their eyes were many and bright, swift they were to behold. Many the hands they guided, the sword was alone. The dun deer troop over the hill, there are many, the hill is one. The dun deer vanish, the hill remains. Come to me from the hills of heather, come from the isles of the sea. O far beholding eagles, here is your meat. Now this song which he made, both words and music, in the hour of our victory, is something less than just to me, who stood beside him in the tussle. Mr. Shawn and 5 more were either killed outright or thoroughly disabled, but of these, 2 fell by my hand, the 2 that came by the skylight. 4 more were hurt, and of that number, 1, and he's not the least important, got his hurt from me. So that, altogether, I did my fair share both of the killing and the wounding, and might have claimed a place in Alan's verses. But poets have to think upon their rhymes, and in good prose talk, Alan always did me more than justice. In the meanwhile, I was innocent of any wrong being done me. For not only I knew no word of the Gaelic, but what with the long suspense of the waiting, and the scurry and strain of our 2 spirits of fighting, and more than all, the horror that I had of some of my own share in it, the thing was no sooner over than I was glad to stagger to a seat. There was that tightness on my chest that I could hardly breathe. The thought of the 2 men I had shot sat upon me like a nightmare, and all upon a sudden, and before I had a guess of what was coming, I began to sob and cry like any child. Alan clapped my shoulder and said I was a brave lad and wanted nothing but sleep. I'll take the first watch, said he. You've done well by me, David, first and last, and I wouldn't lose you for all Appin, no, nor for Breadalbane. So I made upon my bed on the floor, and he took the first spell, pistol in hand and sword on knee, 3 hours by the captain's watch upon the wall. Then he roused me up, and I took my turn of 3 hours, before the end of which it was broad day and a very quiet morning, with a smooth, rolling sea that tossed the ship and made the blood run to and fro on the roundhouse floor, and a heavy rain that drummed upon the roof. All my watch there was nothing stirring, and by the banging of the helm I knew they had even no one at the tiller. Indeed, as I learned afterwards, there were so many of them hurt or dead, and the rest in so ill a temper, that Mr. Riach and the captain had to take turn and turn, like Alan and me, or the brig might have gone ashore and nobody the wiser. It was a mercy the night had fallen so still, for the wind had gone down as soon as the rain began. Even as it was, I judged by the wailing of a great number of gulls that went crying and fishing round the ship that she must have drifted pretty near the coast of one of the islands of the Hebrides, and at last, looking out of the door of the roundhouse, I saw the great stone hills of Skye on the right hand, and a little more astern, the strange Isle of Rum. We'll stop there, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.